Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Jessica Frazier. I'm Associate Professor in the Gender Women Studies and History departments at URI. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kelly Shannon. Dr. Shannon is Associate Professor of History and the Chastain-Johnston Middle Eastern Studies Distinguished Professor of Peace Studies at Florida Atlantic University. She's also the director of Florida Atlantic's Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative. Dr. Shannon's research focuses on US relations with the Islamic world, women's human rights, and transnational history. Her first book, US Foreign Policy and Muslim Women's Human Rights, which was out with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018, explores the integration of American concerns for women's human rights into US policy towards the Islamic world since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. In doing so, it contributes to scholarship on American foreign relations, transnational feminisms, and human rights activism. Dr. Shannon has received numerous fellowships, awards, and distinctions, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rockefeller Archive Foundation, and the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon.
Thank you, Professor Frazier, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. As you know, the 20-year US war in Afghanistan ended this August with catastrophic consequences for the Afghan people. The return of the Taliban to power after the US withdrawal has raised international concerns about human rights violations against many groups of Afghans, given the Taliban's historical track record. Perhaps no group will suffer more under the Taliban's rule than Afghanistan's women, whose rights the Taliban have already moved to curtail. So a lot of Americans have misperceptions about Afghanistan and know little about its history and its people. In my talk tonight, I hope to illuminate the history of US engagement with Afghanistan around the issue of women's rights for you. Many Americans believe that the US policies that aim to advance women's rights in Afghanistan began with the George W. Bush administration and the US invasion in 2001, but that's not exactly the case, as I'll explain. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see that. And tonight I will walk you through the history of how women's human rights became a policy issue for the United States regarding Muslim majority countries, especially Afghanistan. And we can talk about what some of the consequences of this history has been and might be in the future for Afghan women. Okay. So as the US prepared to invade Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, President George W. Bush and his administration informed the world about the United States war goals. In addition to punishing those responsible for the 9/11 attacks, they explained, an important secondary goal, a collateral benefit, as the press dubbed it at the time, was the liberation of Afghan women from Taliban oppression. As First Lady Laura Bush explained in November of 2001, 20 years ago, can't believe that, quote, the fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women. And there was broad support for this policy among most Americans at the time. But at the time, I thought this was weird. US policy had not traditionally focused on women's rights, and liberating women had never been an American war goal before. Moreover, President George W. Bush was not exactly a feminist. Critics at the time and since have charged that Bush's policies around Afghan women were simply US imperialism. In the famous words of scholar Gayatri Spivak, the US was, quote, saving brown women from brown men. Now, these critiques are not necessarily wrong, and Bush's policies certainly were very problematic, but there's a broader historical context that's been left out of these analyses. What I found is that there's actually a longer history here, and Bush's policies reflected a significant shift in US policy that had occurred in the 1990s. So in my book that Professor Frazier referenced, I explain where this shift came from. I found that Americans had grown more sensitive to issues of inequality because of the civil rights, feminist, human rights, and other rights movements of the 1950s and onward, which historians have collectively called the rights revolution. Americans had grown increasingly focused on women's rights in the Islamic world in particular since the late 1970s as a result of the Iranian Revolution. Feminists then lobbied successfully for policies by the 1990s at the United Nations and United States government levels that took women's rights seriously regarding Islamic countries, and that resulted in several novel policy decisions by the Bill Clinton administration. So in many ways, George W. Bush was simply following precedent. This shows the success of feminist activism in getting women's rights institutionalized as a legitimate and important US foreign policy concern before 9/11 and before the US war in Afghanistan. So in my research, I did two things. First, I identified and examined the development of Americans' concerns about women's human rights in the Islamic world. And then I showed how these concerns ultimately influenced US policy. Along the way, Americans combined long-standing stereotypes of Muslim women as harem girls and belly dancers and silent veiled victims of oppression with newer concepts that came from the transnational human rights and feminist movements. And these concepts cast Muslim women as fully human and as actors in their own story. In the end, I argue that American public concern for Muslim women's human rights, combined with feminist activism and lobbying regarding Muslim women after 1979, helped to drive a shift in US policy priorities toward the Islamic world that situated women's human rights as a meaningful policy concern by the 1990s. In pushing for the United States to take women's human rights seriously, public discourse and feminists pushed the United States to embrace a more expansive definition of human rights in its foreign policy, one that included not only condemning state-sponsored human rights violations, but also human rights abuses that occurred in the private sphere, where most violations of women's human rights takes place. And my remarks tonight focus on US women's human rights policies in Afghanistan, but the roots of the story stretch back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and American concerns about Afghan women are part of the development of broader US concerns about women in the Islamic world more generally. For the sake of time, I won't get into this backstory, but if you're interested, we can get into this in the Q&A. I'm going to focus on the US response to the rise of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan in 1996. Now, in the fall of 1997, a year after the Taliban had taken power, thousands of refugees streamed out of the country, as they are doing at the moment. The Taliban, of course, were a group of extremists who had seized control of the Afghan capital city of Kabul in late 1996. On November 18th, 1997, Madeleine Albright, the first female Secretary of State in the United States, went to Nasirbagh refugee camp in Pakistan, which was home to 80,000 Afghan refugees. There, the Secretary of State got down on her knees in the dirt to talk to Afghan schoolgirls. She told them, quote, "I hope I can come visit you again, but come to an Afghanistan where you can live as full equals." Albright spent much of the rest of her brief visit to Pakistan condemning what she called the Taliban's despicable human rights violations against Afghan women and girls, despite the fact that Pakistan, a US ally, had supported the Taliban regime. And there's evidence that they might have helped to create the group in the first place. Now, Albright's visit to Pakistan indicated a broader revolutionary shift in foreign policy priorities under the Clinton administration. This institutionalized women's human rights in domestic and foreign policy priorities. The shift had profound implications for US relations with Islamic countries, especially given increasing US engagement in Muslim countries from Somalia to Bosnia to the Middle East. And there was considerable and growing American public interest in the issue of Muslim women in the 1990s. The Taliban's rise to power and their abuse of women and girls was one of the central issues that mobilized Americans on behalf of Muslim women's human rights in the 1990s. Now, simultaneously to the Clinton administration's focus on women, there was also a reinvigoration of transnational feminism by the early 1990s. Quite simply, women's human rights were on the international agenda. The United States was certainly influenced by this, as well as by the end of the Cold War, which had opened up possibilities for international cooperation on global issues that had not been possible during the Cold War. In short, defense of women's human rights increasingly became a legitimate expression of American identity on the world stage during the late 1990s. In the end, it was a combination of feminist lobbying, the context of US public interest, international opinion, the Clinton administration's predisposition to support women's rights, and finally the appointment of Madeleine Albright in 1997 that led to the denial of recognition of the Taliban after they seized Kabul in 1996. The policy of non-recognition was also paired with policies that aimed to advance women's rights in Afghanistan in a real way. This policy decision was not a preordained outcome. There were US economic and other conventional hard power interests that pushed the United States to potentially engage with the Taliban. Now, to give you some context, Afghanistan is here in Central Asia. Like many countries, it had a homegrown women's rights movement that dated to the 1910s. While over the course of the 20th century, Afghanistan's women's movement was never quite as large or impactful as those in some other countries, such as Egypt. By the early 1970s, Afghan women, especially in urban areas, had made tangible progress toward greater freedom and equality. In the capital city of Kabul, women could and often did become educated, have careers, had a choice in what they wore, including whether or not to wear the headscarf, and they saw improvements in maternal health and legal status. Countrywide, women's status, rights, and experiences varied dramatically depending on where a woman lived, which ethnic group she belonged to, how religious her community and her family were, and her socioeconomic class. Afghan women certainly faced many challenges, as women did globally at the time. But the point here is that they did not face the sort of uniform and harsh repression that the Taliban have sought to impose on them since the 1990s. So a lot of Americans assume that Afghan women have always been horribly oppressed, but that's not the case. It's been political instability and decades of warfare that ultimately led Afghan women's status to slip significantly from the 1970s onward. Now, to give you some backstory on who the Taliban are and where they came from, I have to go back to that history of instability. Afghanistan had largely been a stable country until the early 1970s. At that point, Afghanistan's king left the country on a diplomatic mission, and his cousin, who was the prime minister, Daud Khan, decided to launch a coup and put himself in power. This started Afghanistan's troubles. Daud Khan's government was deeply unpopular, which created space for Afghan communists to seize control in 1978. The communists were a minority, but they were highly organized and had support from the Soviet Union. In a largely religious country, the atheist communists proved deeply unpopular immediately, and the Afghan people began to organize in resistance against their new government. Collectively, the rebels who resisted the communists became known as the Mujahideen. They represented many different factions, but they were united by their opposition to the communists. Now, the opposition to the communist government was so strong that it appeared as though the government would be on the verge of collapse by December of 1979. This is the reason why the Soviet Union invaded in December 1979 to prop up the communist government in Afghanistan. The result was 10 years of bloody and costly warfare in the country. This, of course, caused significant damage and suffering for Afghan civilians in general and women as well. But along with that, women began to see a slip in their status as women. In particular, religious fundamentalists started imposing harsh restrictions on Afghan women in refugee camps in the neighboring country of Pakistan. Now, in response to this political instability and rising anti-woman sentiment in the country, an organization called the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, or RAWA, was founded in the late 70s to oppose both communism and fundamentalism and fight for women's rights. And I'll say that this organization does still exist. Now, the Soviets withdrew from the country in 1989 in defeat, but that did not mean the end of war for the Afghan people. The war between the communist government and the Mujahideen continued until 1992, when the Mujahideen were victorious. This still did not bring peace. Almost immediately, the Mujahideen warlords turned on one another and started a civil war for control of the country that lasted until 1996. Along the way, they committed horrific violations against the Afghan people. So it was in this context that the Taliban began to develop, in the context of the civil war. And most Americans have the misconception that the Taliban and the Mujahideen are one and the same. But in fact, the Taliban are different and they fought against the Mujahideen. The Taliban were founded by a couple of veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War, but the majority of their members were young men who had grown up in the refugee camps in the neighboring country of Pakistan, and who had learned an ultra-conservative version of Islam in the camp's religious schools. The Taliban cast themselves as the saviors of the Afghan people when they first organized themselves. They said they would end the human rights violations that the Mujahideen were carrying out against Afghan civilians, and they would return peace and stability to the country. For this reason, when they first began to seize territory in the country in 1994, the Afghan people welcomed them. It became very clear very quickly, however, that the Taliban were not the saviors that the Afghan people had hoped for. In each area that they seized, they imposed draconian codes of behavior based on their version of Islamic law onto the Afghan people. Key to their vision of creating a radically conservative society was controlling women. And to that end, they established a myriad laws that would essentially erase women from public life. To just give you some examples of what they did, women and girls were no longer allowed to attend school. Women could not work. Women could not leave the home without a male relative as their escort. Women were forced to wear the burqa, which is pictured here. It's traditionally a Pashtun version of the Islamic veil that a lot of Afghan women had never worn before. So it's a large piece of fabric that covers a woman's entire body and has a screen that covers the eyes. Typically it's blue, as you can see here, but occasionally it's also available in mustard, brown, or black. And it's the most extreme form of veiling in the Islamic world. In addition to this, women were not allowed to go to the bathhouses anymore, which by this point was often the only place where they had access to hot water because of the damage done by 2 decades of war. And women were not allowed to be treated by male doctors, but because women were not allowed to work as doctors or nurses, that basically meant women had no access to healthcare. And there were many, many other rules and laws that women were supposed to follow. If they violated any of them, they faced harsh reprisal from the Taliban's religious police, which included violent punishment and even sometimes public execution. So as the Taliban took power in Kabul, it coincidentally coincided with the revitalization of international feminism in the 1990s that positioned global feminists to be able to do something about the Taliban's rise. Now, a key example of the reinvigoration of feminism was the impact of feminist lobbying on the UN World Conference on Human Rights held in Vienna, Austria in 1993. Here, the United Nations declared that women's rights are human rights. And that might seem like common sense, but until that point, historically, the UN had treated women's rights and human rights as separate categories. And this led to the ghettoization of women's rights within the UN system until international feminism began to become a prominent force in the 1970s and after. Now, the declaration that women's rights are human rights was important. It allowed feminists to pressure states to take action to remedy abuses against women that occurred in the private sphere. What this meant for the Taliban is that they could not claim that their treatment of women was a cultural issue that was nobody else's business. Now, according to international law, human rights and women's rights are universal and were very much the business of the international community. Another key development in the resurgence of global feminism in the 90s was the development of important non-governmental organizations that had influence at the international level. One that's important to this story is the Sisterhood is Global Institute, which I'll call SIGI for the rest of this talk. SIGI was founded in the early 1980s by the US radical feminist Robin Morgan, but it was founded explicitly as an international organization from the start, and its founders included members from around the world. The organization struggled to operate throughout the 1980s, but in 1990, its leadership was taken over by Manaz Afkhami. She had been the Minister for Women's Affairs under the Shah of Iran in the 1970s and was a committed and politically savvy international feminist activist. Under her leadership, there was an organizational resurrection such that SIGI quickly became the premier non-governmental organization working at the international level, specifically around the issue of women's human rights in Muslim countries. And under Afkhami's leadership, its leading group was made up primarily of women from Muslim countries. So SIGI in the early 90s engaged successfully in fundraising, special projects, conferences, letter writing campaigns, they attended UN meetings, and they published academic books that were among the first to apply human rights concepts specifically to women's situation in Islamic countries. A major publication by SIGI was Claiming Our Rights, a manual for women's human rights education in Muslim societies, which they published in early 1996. They used this manual to hold workshops on the ground in Islamic countries to teach local women what their rights were according to international law. And this project drew significant international attention, and including the attention of then US Ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright. SIGI also sent a delegation to the 1995 UN Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China, where the leaders of SIGI met Hillary Rodham Clinton, the First Lady. Hillary Clinton then invited Manaz Afghani to the White House a few months later. So SIGI positioned itself to lobby US policymakers just as the Taliban were coming to power in Afghanistan, and they would play an important role in helping shape the US response. Of course, for feminist lobbying to have any impact, they have to have a sympathetic ear in Washington, and the Clinton administration provided that. The Clinton administration mainstreamed and institutionalized women's rights. As it did so, it adopted a feminist language that drew upon universal concepts and human rights language. It scrupulously avoided using stereotypes, particularly when talking about Muslim women, and it attempted to avoid an imperial approach. Instead, it organized and worked closely with women on the ground in countries around the world and allowed women from other countries to take the lead whenever possible. The Clinton administration argued that women's rights were very much in the US national interest. This was a new, potentially revolutionary policy outlook coming from Washington. No presidency had ever made this argument before. It was a slow process, but the administration worked immediately and consistently toward mainstreaming women's equality across the entire executive branch and to put women's rights at the center of US foreign policy concerns. To provide a few examples, at the Vienna conference, Secretary of State Warren Christopher, who was Secretary of State during Clinton's first term, collaborated with women's rights activists to shape the conference's outcome. That is the UN's declaration that women's rights are human rights. The US also used USAID and development aid specifically as a tool of women's empowerment, which is the first time the United States did this. Clinton also created new institutions. One of them was the President's Interagency Council on Women, which coordinated all of the different executive branch units together to make sure that women's rights were being considered seriously across every unit. Hillary Rodham Clinton was the honorary chair of the PICW, and she was deeply involved in all of the administration's women's rights agendas. Now, an important part for this story is the fact that the PICW brought non-governmental organizations into the policy process, thus providing access and setting in motion a process by which feminist NGOs like SIGI later directly influenced the US response to the rise of the Taliban. And previous administrations had not really worked with NGOs in this way before. Clinton also reorganized the State Department to emphasize new global priorities. One new institution in the State Department that he created was the Office of International Women's Issues in 1994. This was housed under the brand new Office of Global Affairs, which was headed by Undersecretary Tim Wirth, who was a feminist ally and a proponent of working with non-governmental organizations. In 1996, a few weeks before the Taliban took Kabul, a woman named Teresa Lohr became the senior coordinator for international women's issues and therefore the head of the Office of International Women's Issues. She was a career foreign service officer, and she had been the director of the President's Interagency Council on Women. And she proved to be a key policy player during the Clinton years that helped to really deepen the administration's commitment to women's rights. Final example of the Clinton administration's focus on women's rights is the First Lady's visit to the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. Hillary Rodham Clinton had played a key role in supporting, developing, and articulating the administration's global gender policies. In her keynote address to the conference, she famously declared, quote, "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights once and for all." Her speech made international front page news, but this was not a new policy. Instead, her address was an affirmation of the policy changes underway since January of 1993. Now, I think it's important to point out that the Clinton administration recognized that the United States was not a paragon of gender equality. This, I think, lent more credibility to its attempts to institutionalize women's rights globally. So it paired its women's rights foreign policy agenda with domestic policies that sought to address gender inequality at home in a serious way. The administration also recognized that Americans don't have all of the answers, and they worked closely with feminists from around the world, listened to them, and often let them set the agenda. Again, I want to stress that the administration tried to avoid acting imperially when it came to the women's rights agenda. All of these things laid the groundwork for non-recognition of the Taliban. However, some people in the State Department wanted to engage with the Taliban and work with them rather than condemn their treatment of women. So starting in early 1995, members of Warren Christopher's State Department began to meet with Taliban representatives. So this is about a year and a half before the Taliban seized control of the government. This was the initiative of the South Asia Bureau, which was led by Undersecretary of State Robin Raffel. And based on my research, this is not something that Secretary of State Christopher had wanted to see happen. Now, the members of the South Asia Bureau had several reasons for wanting to work with the Taliban. And in general, those staff members on the South Asia Bureau, all the way up to Undersecretary Raffel, were opponents of the president's women's rights agenda. They just thought it was a frivolous policy concern. So for them, they hoped that the Taliban would return stability and peace to Afghanistan after 2 decades of war. They also hoped that because the Taliban were strictly observant Muslims, they could help root out the problem of Afghan opium production and therefore assist the United States in the global war against drugs. The United States also hoped that the Taliban could help the US find a person of interest named Osama bin Laden. Now, we know that this hope was misplaced because the Taliban later gave safe haven to bin Laden and al-Qaeda, but this is what the South Asia Bureau hoped as of 1995-96. The United States and the South Asia Bureau also relied on the advice of Pakistan when it came to Afghanistan. And as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan helped orchestrate the rise of the Taliban to power, and so it pushed the United States to engage with the Taliban, especially once they seized control of the government. But perhaps the biggest motivator for the South Asia Bureau in dealing with the Taliban had to do with oil. A US oil company named Unocal planned to connect the oil and natural gas reserves of Central Asia from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan to global markets via an oil pipeline. The oil and natural gas was worth an estimated $4 trillion and promised to enrich all countries involved in the project. And as you can see from the map here, the pipeline had to go across Afghan territory in order to make it to global markets through the ports in India. Now, the Taliban promised to provide the necessary security for pipeline construction. Therefore, the Unocal oil company pressed the United States to do business with the Taliban. They spent $2 million in the year 1996 alone to lobby the White House, Congress, and the State Department to do business with the Taliban. And they hired ex-US officials as spokespeople to promote a positive view of the Taliban in Washington, D.C. and in the US public. Now, initially, the US government did support the pipeline project starting in 1995. And the US Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan hosted events for Unocal as well as security briefings and provided early conduits to the Taliban for Unocal executives. There was initially, therefore, a positive response from the State Department as the Taliban started seizing more and more control of Afghanistan. After her first meeting with Taliban representatives in April of 1996, several months before they seized Kabul, Undersecretary of State Robin Raffel said, quote, "They have wonderful senses of humor." This, despite the fact that she had to sit with her back to the Taliban when they met because they refused to look on her unveiled face. Later, State Department spokesperson Glenn Davies told the press the day after the Taliban seized Kabul, quote, "We've seen some of the reports that they've moved to impose Islamic law in the areas that they control. But at this stage, we're not reading anything into that. I mean, there's on the face of it, nothing objectionable." The US media reaction to this statement was swift and condemnatory. As journalists pointed out, when Islamic law had been imposed in Iran in 1979, it meant a significant loss of rights for women. And journalists expressed confusion that Clinton's State Department would make such statements given the president's administration's focus on women's rights. Now, very quickly, the Clinton administration started to distance itself from the statements coming from the South Asia Bureau. Now, there was a presidential election coming up in November of 1996, and women were a key constituency for Bill Clinton. However, there was more than electoral politics at play here. First, engaging with the Taliban went against the administration's core values, especially those of the First Lady, who had significant policy influence. And second, there was actually a power struggle happening behind the scenes within the State Department that the public didn't know about between Theresa Lore's Office of International Women's Issues and Robin Raffel's South Asia Bureau. Now, because Lore's position was new, it was unclear who had more power. Historically, the Afghan desk and the South Asia Bureau would have to sign off on Afghan policy positions before it went up the chain to the Secretary of State. But because of the reorganization of the State Department, it provided Theresa Lore with an opportunity to just take the initiative, define her own status, and outmaneuver the South Asia Bureau. In doing so, she made the Office of International Women's Issues into a truly influential institution. Now, the way she did this is by circumventing the Bureau and cultivating more powerful allies. One was her boss, Tim Wirth. The other was Nick Burns, a spokesperson and the acting Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs in the State Department, as well as a close advisor to Secretary of State Warren Christopher. These two allies outranked Undersecretary Raffel, and therefore Lore could simply go around the South Asia Bureau and have her women's rights policies become the priority over the objections of the South Asia Bureau and the Afghan desk. Lore crafted additional alliances as well, with NGOs, with Afghan exiles, UN agencies, other areas of the State Department, the First Lady, members of Congress, and eventually Secretary Christopher himself. She therefore cultivated widespread support for a policy emphasis on Afghan women. Now, there's evidence that Lore was beginning to win the power struggle by late 1996. In December of 1996, as Warren Christopher was about to retire, he made Undersecretary Raffel reply to a letter from the Taliban foreign minister, who had written seeking US support for the Taliban to fill Afghanistan's seat at the UN. And in essence, he was asking for US recognition. Christopher made Raffel reject the request and instead emphasize women's rights concerns. And it's very clear that this came from Christopher because Robin Raffel, again, did not really support or buy into the administration's focus on women's rights. Now, when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright took office in January 1997, she publicly announced the policy emphasis on women and led the charge personally against the Taliban. Albright also settled the remaining power struggle between Lore and the South Asia Bureau and the State Department by clearly siding with Lore and the Office of International Women's Issues. Now, Albright had been the US ambassador to the United Nations during Clinton's first term, and she was a lifelong feminist, so it's not surprising that she took the position she did. Under Albright, there were personnel changes in state that brought the Afghan desk and the South Asia Bureau into alignment with her emphasis on Afghan women's rights. Every person on the Afghan desk either retired or was reassigned by the summer of 1997, including Undersecretary Robin Raffel. Her replacement was Carl Rick Inderfirth, who had embraced the women's rights agenda and became a key ally of the Office of International Women's Issue. In March of 1997, at an International Women's Day event at the State Department, Secretary Albright and the First Lady both personally and very forcefully denounced the Taliban and their treatment of women. Albright declared that women's rights were now a foreign policy imperative for the United States, and she condemned the Taliban's treatment of women. Hillary Clinton also condemned the Taliban and stated the US should not do business with them, specifically because of their oppression of women and girls. She publicly opposed the pipeline deal, and when she did that, the writing was on the wall. The First Lady and Secretary Albright then continued to condemn the Taliban in clear terms for the rest of Clinton's time in office through January of 2001. And shortly after the March 1997 International Women's Day event, the State Department declared, quote, "Women's rights in Afghanistan are a fundamental expression of foreign policy." So it was in this context that Secretary Albright went to Nasir Bagh refugee camp in November of 1997. And yet, as of that point, the United States had not formally declared a policy of non-recognition of the Taliban's government. It still needed a push, and that push came from feminist activism. Instead of non-recognition, the US could have pursued a more ambiguous wait and see policy where they didn't declare recognition, but they also did not declare non-recognition. And that's kind of where they had been going up until this point. But it's because of feminist campaigns that the administration took that final step to adopt non-recognition as its formal policy. The public wing of the feminist lobbying campaign came from a group called the Feminist Majority Foundation. This was an organization founded in the United States in the late 1980s. It was primarily domestically focused organization and the feminist majority mainly focused on reproductive rights early on. But after the UN Conference on Human Rights in 1993, they became more interested in global affairs. The women who ran this organization tended to be elite white women who had little international experience, and as far as I can tell, no prior contacts with Afghan women or real knowledge of the Islamic world in general. The head of the feminist majority was Eleanor Smeal, a longtime feminist activist in the United States. In 1997, the feminist majority launched its campaign to end gender apartheid in Afghanistan, headed by Mavis Leno, the wife of the comedian and Tonight Show host Jay Leno. Now, the name of this campaign has significance. First, there were feminist protests during the first Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 against what feminists at the time called the practice of gender apartheid in South Africa. So this campaign harkened back to that earlier anti-war activism by American feminists. But more important, both of those feminist campaigns used the term gender apartheid as a way to try to get the international community to see the oppression of women as being as equally as abhorrent as racial apartheid in South Africa. And the global anti-apartheid movement had recently been successful in ousting the apartheid regime in South Africa in the early 1990s. So feminist activists were hoping to build on that momentum and transfer that anger about racial apartheid onto the treatment of women. Now, despite their lack of real knowledge about international affairs or about the Islamic world, the feminist majority was media savvy and launched a very effective media offensive that significant public opinion in favor of Afghan women and against the Taliban. The organization also targeted the Unocal pipeline. And they were so successful that they even got a shareholder of the oil company to give up his seat to Mavis Leno at one of the shareholder meetings where she could confront the Unocal executives face to face. I could not find records of this meeting, but you can just imagine what that must have been like. So, this campaign was wildly successful in drumming up public opinion in the United States against the Taliban. But I want to point out that the feminist majority took an Orientalist and colonial feminist approach to the issue of Afghan women, meaning they drew on old stereotypes of Muslim women. They didn't really have Afghan women speak for themselves, and they cast American feminists as rescuers of Afghan women, which was highly problematic. They also tended to focus on the issue of women being forced to wear the burqa as a major problem, whereas Afghan women, of course, were not thrilled to be forced to wear it, but they had other problems that were more pressing to them. So despite the problematic approach of the feminist majority, they did prove effective in mobilizing public opinion. And the Unocal oil company was no match for the Feminist Majority Foundation. The public turned against the pipeline deal, the US government withdrew its support, and Unocal was forced to cancel its pipeline plans. So despite the FMF's clearly problematic framing of Afghan women's situation, nevertheless, blocking the pipeline from being built was a truly anti-imperial action. They had prevented a major US company from profiting off of the exploitation and oppression of Afghan women. Now, the feminist majority had influence on the US public, but they did not have the ear of policymakers. It was the Sisterhood Global Institute who had the behind the scenes access to US policymakers and who played a significant role in helping shape the US policy response to the rise of the Taliban. As you can see here in this picture, the women of SIGI first met with Madeleine Albright in the spring of 1996 when she was still the UN ambassador, but she was so impressed with them that she invited them back when she was Secretary of State. The SIGI members consulted with the State Department, the Office of International Women's Issues, and the First Lady's office over and over again for the next several years regarding Afghanistan. At the same time, Sima Wali, an Afghan feminist and one of SIGI's founding members, also testified before Congress. The women of SIGI, who were primarily at this point women from Muslim countries, consistently and forcefully urged the US to adopt a policy of non-recognition. This was a pivotal reinforcement of the Clinton administration's predispositions that helped spur this policy action. Now, it's important that SIGI was the group that was talking to policymakers. They had a more nuanced approach to Afghan women's situation, and as women from Muslim countries, they had far more expertise than the women of the Feminist Majority Foundation. These women and SIGI used the language of universal human rights and women's rights. They brought Muslim perspectives directly to policymakers, and they connected policymakers with Afghan women and Afghan feminist organizations like RAWA and the Afghan Women's Network. SIGI urged cooperation, not rescue. And they pushed the United States to pair non-recognition with significant education and development aid. So it was this reinforcement and that these policy pieces of advice from SIGI that really proved useful for Theresa Lohr and for US policymakers. And the United States began to signal in late 1997 that it would adopt non-recognition. Finally, in early 1998, the US declared publicly non-recognition as its policy. It stated, quote, "The United States does not plan to extend diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. We do not plan to recognize any government unless it is broad-based, representative of all Afghans, and respects international norms of behavior and human rights, including the human rights of women and girls." And denial of recognition to the Taliban was significant. It meant that they could not access the financial resources of a legitimate government. They could not represent Afghanistan at the United Nations, and it made them a global pariah. There was full congressional support for non-recognition, which is a rare moment of bipartisanship in the 1990s, and I guess still today, because Democrats and Republicans don't generally agree. Now, non-recognition put the United States into alignment with the rest of the world. Every single country, with the exception of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, denied recognition to the Taliban government. But the Clinton administration stuck to this policy, even after it began to turn its focus to terrorism after 1998, and it became clear that the Taliban were harboring the al-Qaeda terrorist network. Now, the United States paired non-recognition with significant aid for Afghan women. Non-recognition was a powerful symbolic statement, but aid was a way to do more to help women on the ground and for the United States to literally put its money where its mouth was. By the time Clinton left office, the US was the largest provider of aid to the Afghan people, spending $200 million in total. And a lot of this was channeled through the United Nations and non-governmental organizations. And a significant portion of that $200 million was dedicated specifically to women's empowerment. This was not a magic bullet. Women were not suddenly liberated. The Taliban didn't go away, but it was a big step. Condemning the Taliban, therefore, was not merely rhetoric, but rather the clearest example of the administration's attempts to position women's human rights in the mainstream of US policy. So this is a crucial moment. It was a major victory for transnational feminists and the closest thing to a truly human rights-driven decision you will ever see the US government make. It's also completely inexplicable, according to traditional interpretations of US diplomacy, because in this case, women's human rights outweighed tangible economic and strategic interests. And scholars typically say it's those economic and military interests that tend to drive US policy, but here the opposite was what happened. What this shows is that there were changes in the US approach to foreign affairs in the 90s that were unpredictable and important. It set an important precedent for women's activists and a precedent for future presidents to follow. But it was one that had the potential for good or for increasing tension between the US and the Islamic world and potentially masking more imperial US designs on countries like Afghanistan. Now, as I mentioned, Bill Clinton's administration had sought to avoid an imperial approach in its women's rights policies. The George W. Bush administration, on the other hand, embraced older stereotypes about Muslim peoples. It took a more imperial approach. It embraced the rescue narrative being pushed by groups like the feminist majority, and it most problematically paired women's rights with US military intervention, first in Afghanistan and then later in Iraq. Later, the Obama administration attempted to return to that universal human rights and not as imperial approach as the Clinton years. But during Obama's presidency, there was a tension between the White House and Hillary Rodham Clinton's State Department when the White House was not sufficiently supportive of women's rights. One key example was that the Afghan government legalized marital rape during the Obama presidency, and the president's response was very lukewarm. And Secretary of State Clinton had to really come out and blast both the Afghan government and Obama for not opposing this. And then the Obama White House stepped back from using a lot of women's rights language after Secretary Clinton left after his first term. So we're still dealing with the complicated legacy of this story. And I think the conclusion of this story would have been very different had the November 2016 presidential election gone differently. But as it is, the Trump administration gutted the State Department, abandoned human rights altogether as a policy priority, and was actively hostile to women's rights at home and abroad. The administration's anti-Muslim rhetoric ratcheted up tensions with the Islamic world, and it was the Trump administration who initiated the negotiations with the Taliban that set in motion the disastrous US withdrawal from Afghanistan that was completed this past August. In these negotiations, Afghan women's rights were clearly not a concern for either side, and the negotiations undermined the position of the Afghan government, which was supposed to be the US's ally. Now, the Biden administration early on this year declared that it was restoring women's human rights as a key policy priority. It announced the creation of a White House Gender Policy Council in March, and late last month declared a national strategy on gender inequality. And yet, the way in which Biden carried out the US withdrawal from Afghanistan this summer has made it very clear that when push comes to shove, other policy priorities override the president's commitment to women's rights. And so I think Afghanistan's future looks bleak. Its economy is in the process of collapsing. It faces a looming hunger crisis and climate crisis. The COVID pandemic, of course, continues to rage. And the Taliban have engaged in violent reprisals against multiple groups, ranging from former government employees to journalists and NGO workers. But based on their historical treatment of Afghan women and their recent murders of women politicians and journalists, harassment of prominent or educated women, sexual assaults and kidnapping of women to become the Taliban's quote unquote wives, and the reimposition of severe restrictions on Afghan women, it is likely that the Taliban's return to power portends a grim future for Afghan women, at least in the near future. So as citizens of the country that fought a war in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, and that made a series of poor decisions that led to the current outcome, I think it's important for Americans to know the history that I have just laid out, and for Americans not to turn our backs on the Afghan people or the promises that have been made to Afghan women. As former US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Milan Verveer once put it, women are a foreign policy issue. Seriously, guys. Thank you. And I am happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Dr. Shannon. Yes, we have time for a few questions, and if you'd like to type those into the chat, we'll be able to take them from there. So I'll give everyone a minute or two to get a chance to type their questions in. Perhaps while we wait, I was wondering, Dr. Shannon, about some of the aid that the United States provided in the 1990s. You said that they were providing aid to Afghan women that funded women's empowerment in particular. And I was just wondering what kind of programs they were funding.
So they were funding a lot of programs that, in particular, at the time, were helping women in refugee communities. It was harder to impact Afghanistan on the ground because of the Taliban's rule in the US, lack of relationship with the government. So they were supporting women's education programs. Microloans was actually something the Clinton administration pioneered in terms of foreign policy. I mean, other people have come up with the idea, but they were the first administration to engage in that. So this helped women's economic empowerment. And the idea was that helping women in terms of education and their economic status raises all boats. And then they also funded the United Nations women's programs, and they funded organizations where they could provide help to groups like RAWA. And RAWA was really pivotal in getting information about the Taliban's abuses against the Afghan people and against Afghan women out to the public, where they would smuggle in recording equipment. And for the students in the group, it wasn't like a little smartphone. They had to have like an actual big video camera that they would hide and bring into the Kabul soccer stadium and videotape the public executions. And they would take pictures and video of the Taliban beating women, and then they would smuggle it out of the country and get it to international news networks and stuff. So there were a lot of different ways the US government was filtering through the UN programs and through trying to help organizations that already had a presence on the ground. But I will say that I don't think that these policies were able to help women in the heart of Afghanistan in the way that the administration wanted to, because they just couldn't penetrate the country the way that they would have liked.
Thank you. So I have a question from the chat, and then we have two people's hands were up, Smita and Jeffrey, but I'll go with the question from the chat first. So I have a question from Jenna. How can we help support Afghan people and women from here? So is there anything that you would suggest that we can actually do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation. I would say first, contact your political representatives. Make sure that they know that you still care about the issue of Afghan women and you don't want the United States to turn away. And then also push them to help break the logjam for trying to get Afghan refugees out of Afghanistan and into the United States. The US government has claimed, they airlifted out X number of Afghans, but there are a lot of professional women, there are a lot of journalists, there are a lot of scholars, men and women, who are still stuck in the country who can't get out. And there are a lot of others who are in third countries like Pakistan, where their visa applications are just not getting processed. And they're facing potentially becoming undocumented in those third countries because their visas to be in those third countries are running out. So there needs to be pressure on the US to help evacuate people who are stuck in these third countries. And there are also migrants in Central Europe that are caught up in the political struggle between Poland and Belarus. So there are Afghan migrants who've been stopped by the Polish and Belarusian governments who are stuck in these camps along the Polish-Belarusian border, who are facing winter setting in. So I think if you can draw attention to that, that's helpful. Another thing you could do is to donate to organizations who are actively trying to help. So there's I forget the exact name. It's an American Lutheran, LIRS is their acronym. It's a Lutheran organization that's helping provide assistance to Afghan refugees once they get to the United States. There are groups like the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan who still exist that you could donate to, the UN's women's organizations you could donate to. And then I would say to keep talking about it, because right now there's a real danger that the United States will just wash its hands of the situation, say, oh, well, we tried, and then leave the mess behind that the US created. And the Afghan people are going to be the ones who suffer.
Thank you. Professor Diamond, did you want to unmute to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. How are you doing? Thank you very much for the talk. I found it very interesting. Let me put my hand down. There it goes. Good. I had a kind of two-part question, and I just like to ask two-part questions. Sorry, I guess a historian. And one is, the Taliban are really a complex group, and the whole situation in Afghanistan is really complex. It wasn't just, George Bush saying that he wanted to save women. The Soviets said the exact same thing in 1979. And you go back to other discourses in colonial times, from the British to others, who's made similar claims in the region, let alone in the Muslim world. And it tends to, when we look at it, we tend to look at it from our own perspective. How can we look at it from a perspective of the Afghans themselves? And what I mean by that is not just people like Siggy, who are actually, and nothing wrong with them, but they're elite, right? They're mostly Western educated. They mostly live in the West. How do we look at it from the average Afghan woman's perspective as a way to really understand what some of their concerns are? Because we tend to see, and I'm not going to justify this, I don't know, anyone who's been in the region knows the Taliban can be quite brutal, but at the same time, we tend to glorify, or not glorify, what's the word I'd call it, to overplay extremist pictures you see about maybe executions in stadiums, or someone like the picture you had of someone being beaten by a religious police, without looking at the everyday life of people and what's going on there. And when you live through civil war, security is probably more important than worrying about other things. And that was kind of what you're talking about is the fight that was going on in the State Department is dealing with those exact issues. So how do we look at it from not the perspective of so-called, and I saw these questions in the chat, which is, Europeans or Americans telling other people how to live their lives in a different cultural context, but also even elites who are also influenced by that in those countries. Do they really represent those views? And I'm asking that because this situation is so much more complex than just to say the Taliban are good or bad. And so how do we get this more kind of complex picture is what I'm asking, basically.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, so the women from Muslim countries who tend to have a voice in the United States, as you pointed out, do tend to come from an elite background. They tend to kind of literally and figuratively speak Americans' language. But it gets back to debates within Muslim countries about authenticity, right? Who has the right to determine what's authentic and what's not? Is it male religious leaders who have a vested interest in maintaining patriarchy, or is it women who might challenge that? Or is it women who don't challenge that and are perfectly happy with the traditional lifestyle, right? And so to answer your question, I mean, there's really no typical Afghan woman.
No.
And so what we have to do is, as most Americans don't have access to women in Afghanistan, and so we have to look for those voices. There is reporting that I think has done a really good job of trying to get at women, especially in rural areas, and what their experiences have been over the last several decades. The Guardian actually did a really good job of having a series of articles this past year about that. And what we found is that, Afghan women, just like women everywhere, have a variety of experiences and a variety of desires. And for some women, they didn't think the Taliban were great, but in rural areas, they at least brought a measure of stability after the Civil War. And then the US war brought back death and destruction.
Yes.
So for them, it's a more complicated picture than for women living in a city. But there was, if you look at responses to programs, whether they're US or international programs, there did seem to be a common desire, at least for women to be educated, a common desire for peace, for economic prosperity. And so women's issues are really every issue that impacts people. It's not just women specific, but also economic issues, as you pointed out. So, we have to kind of go searching for journalists, for scholars who've talked to women in Afghanistan, for Afghans who are able to speak to the West, but who have family contacts back in Afghanistan or who visit often, and they can bring those voices to us. And then the women's rights organizations, a lot of the ones on the ground are dealing with women at the village level and are dealing with women at the street level. They themselves might be elites, but they at least have closer contact with women from other backgrounds, and they're able to relay those views. But you're right. It's not all hearts and roses. And I don't think that the US coming in and saying you're going to liberate your women at gunpoint was the best approach post 2001. And that's why I think it was sort of that more behind the scenes approach that the Clinton people did, with the humility that the Clinton people had, and where they said, we're working on ourselves too, and we're all in this together. I think that was a better approach than what's happened since the start of the US war. And then there's the problem too, that like post 2001, the US wasn't very good at tracking where its women's rights program money went and how much of an impact there actually was. And, there are a lot of other problematic things that the US did as well. So I think if you're interested, there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called No Good Men Among the Living, that talks about a lot of these mistakes that the US did that actually re-radicalized a lot of Afghans who had turned away early on in the US war, and the Taliban had, for all intents and purposes, surrendered in the early 2000s. And then the US continued to engage in behavior that re-radicalized people. If you're killing people, obviously that's hurting women and children, right? And so I think there's a real reckoning that the United States needs to have with its own actions in that country.
Well, I was asking that because not just because of that reason, but for real change, and you were getting at it, for not just organizations like Rawa, but for real change to take place, it has to come from internally.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debates. I mean, when we look at this on the outside, I think most people here probably don't realize there's a lot of rights women have if you just use an Islamic discourse. So you can actually engage it within the traditions themselves, which would be more amenable to people who already are abhorrent to outside influence. So if you come in and just say you abuse your woman, we don't like you, they're not going to listen, obviously. But if you come in and you work with people internally on those sorts of situations, that's much more effective. And not just elites, but on the ground people in different areas as well. That's why I was asking you that, as opposed to, yes, anything, democracy by gunpoint doesn't work. It didn't work in Iraq or Afghanistan, let alone anything they sought to do, which was kind of predictable. But I'm talking about what can we do going forward, instead of just looking at this kind of stark thing, good and bad, and try to work with what we have in a situation.
Yeah. And I mean, there are Islamic feminists who interpret the religion in a feminist way. And then groups like SIGI were working, depending on the community, they were working in the Islamic context. The problem with the Taliban is that their version of Islam is not traditional to Afghanistan. And it's kind of far afield from what a lot of people in Afghanistan themselves had been used to. And so trying to negotiate that, is the Taliban's version of Islam versus, let's say, the villagers' version of Islam is going to be really difficult. So that villager might say, yes, educating my daughter is important, but the Taliban are still going to come back and say no, right? And then what do you do with that? And right now for the US, there's the question of whether the US should engage with the Taliban government or deny it recognition again. And we haven't worked out what that relationship's going to be. And so there's very little influence that the US currently has.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. So I have another question from the chat for you, Dr. Shannon. So this one asks, what are the prospects for the US government to make an intervention in Afghanistan, given the loss of legitimacy that has occurred in the past few years for the US generally, internationally?
That's a great question. And I hate to be kind of a downer, but I don't think that the prospects look very good right now. I think the US, as you pointed out, has lost international legitimacy for a lot of reasons over the last 5 to 10 years. The loss in Afghanistan, I think, has diminished American credibility even more because of the chaotic way that the withdrawal played out. And I don't see the political will in the Biden administration at this point to really do much more with Afghanistan. What you're hearing from US advisors and spokespeople is like, well, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, and the US tried and it didn't work. And so we're just going to turn our back because people there that's just how they are. And that's actually, it's such a bad take. That graveyard of empires thing, first of all, skips over about 1,500 years in between Alexander the Great and the British attempts to colonize Afghanistan, when Afghanistan was part of empires and was the seat of some empires. But also a lot of the conditions in Afghanistan post-2001 have been created by the United States. And so the US to wash its hands is denying culpability for the US role in creating the conditions there. And I think denying that also reduces American credibility. If the US can't own up to its mistakes, then I think that doesn't bode well. The US has also, I think, shown that its power in a lot of areas is diminishing, and that's why we're seeing a rising confidence from powers like China. And so, I mean, to be honest with you, I think it's going to be regional countries, Afghanistan's neighbors, and maybe the Chinese, who might have a greater chance of having a say in trying to convince, the Taliban to respect human rights more so than the US.
And another question from the chat. Thank you for that. So you had mentioned that Afghan women's rights became a global issue. So why can't the United Nations use policies to help the rights of women today, especially now that the Taliban has taken more control?
They could. They absolutely could. I just haven't seen the political will happening. And in the 90s, the UN was this organization that I think had a lot of hope and a lot of energy, and the Cold War was over, and there was this real sense that, you know, the world was entering a time of peace and democracy, and the countries could work together to solve issues like population issues and the environment and women's rights. And that kind of atmosphere, I think, has not existed since 9/11. I think the war on terror really put the brakes on that. But that's not to say that the UN couldn't decide to be more proactive in pushing the human rights and women's rights issue in Afghanistan. Of course, the big problem with the UN is the Security Council, and it has veto power over any major actions that the UN might take. So I think the UN would have to push a women's rights agenda more through like UNICEF and UNIFEM and its subsidiaries rather than through the General Assembly quite as much. Because I don't think that, especially the 5 permanent members, the US, the Chinese, the Russians, the British, and the French, are going to agree enough on anything for the UN to really take action.
And so what you're just talking about, I think this other question from from someone else from the chat who's saying that they feel very discouraged by what's going on. And what would you do now if you could wave a magic wand?
For Afghanistan in general or the world?
Maybe both.
Maybe both. Oh, wow. I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, I think, you know, I'd go way back and have the 2000 presidential election go differently, 9/11 not happen, get rid of climate change, and then definitely, you know, for Afghanistan, I would want to see a different set of US decisions early in the war when the Taliban was about to surrender that would have accepted that and not continue to try to root out what the US perceived as radicals, but it turns out they weren't, and then torture and kill people and then re-radicalize people. I think, you know, there's so many things that the US did wrong that we'd have to just kind of erase the last 20 plus years and start over again. But if we can't do that, I would wave my magic wand and have the Afghan government still be in power and have the Taliban be not a factor in Afghanistan, and have a true possibility for the Afghan people to figure out their own future, because I don't think they were given that. The Afghan government was always set up to be dependent on the US presence. And once that US presence was suddenly gone, of course, they're going to collapse. And we have to remember it takes a really long time to build a successful democracy. The United States, we went through 2 forms of government before we got to the Constitution. We had a civil war 100 years later. We're still struggling with our own democracy. And so I think there's often a lack of patience when it comes to democratic movements in other countries. Not just in Afghanistan, but also in places like Egypt and Libya. But I think it's important to remember the long term. If people are given a chance and they're given the resources, they'll figure it out. But I just don't think the Afghan people have been given those things.
Thank you. And we have one last question. Sorry, I have to scroll through the chat to find it again. So the last question that we have for you is, why did groups think that they could negotiate with the Taliban to improve the situation in Afghanistan in the first place?
I mean, my cynical take on it is that I think that the Trump administration just wanted out. You know, withdrawing from the war is part of the America First strategy that played well with Trump's base and with a lot of people who didn't support Trump, but also were tired of the war. And they were looking for any show of cooperation from the Taliban that would give the US that out. And I think from the Taliban's perspective, they knew how badly the US wanted to leave, and they said what the US wanted to hear and got the US to agree to withdraw. And then, I mean, the Taliban didn't really abide by a lot of their promises, but the Trump administration and the Biden administration looked the other way because they had agreements on paper at least, and then they withdrew because that's what the US decided it was going to do, regardless of what the situation on the ground was. And the real kicker is that they didn't, I mean, the Trump administration did not include the Afghan government in these negotiations. I mean, that's a clear signal that they honestly didn't care what happened to the country. They just wanted to get out. And I think that's really shameful. I mean, I don't think the US should have continued the war. The war itself has been horrifically destructive and horrible for the Afghan people. But I think the way the US withdrew just made the situation far worse. and it was avoidable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shannon. Thank you everyone for all the great questions in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of them, but we will save the chat for Dr. Shannon so she can see them.
Thank you.
But thank you everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Thanks for having me. And Jessica, maybe we can catch up in person at some point.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Shannon. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, students, faculty, staff, and visitors from other universities.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Okay, Katie, I've saved the chat.
Oh, good. I was just going to ask you. I'm never good at doing that. I was going to I was going to cut and paste, and that never works. So let me.
Yeah, I saved it. I'm not exactly sure where it's saved, but I saved it somewhere. Oh, we should stop recording.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, let me do that right now.
You're still recording.